you can't really even compare poets because each one has to be seen in a unique way. And then that says, well, that means I'm also unique in a way that I could never even imagine, and I will only know through what I discover as I write.
I was so much looking forward to speaking with you today.
Yeah, me as well. I was looking forward to it this week. Yeah.
Nice. I'll start with
Yes.
just when did you start writing poetry and why?
I grew up, I'm really fortunate now, I realize, that I grew up in a family that for whom culture, in particular writing and the arts, were really important. My dad had been into visual art and then was into playwriting by the time I was growing up. And my mother loved poetry from an early age, but was more, well, reading fiction and then later on writing some short stories and poetry. And I realized that she writes very beautiful poetry as well. I was sort of like surrounded by it, but also at the primary school that I went to, which was the United Nations School in New York City. I don't know. Poetry seemed to be something that was. I think it is just it's a general thing that there's respect for poetry among primary school teachers. They kind of get it, and then we forget it later on, and only those who specialize in English lit or something like that realize that it is something really significant for the growth of the human soul or something like that. So, anyways, it was encouraged. I wrote when I was in a little bit when I was in primary school. My teachers encouraged me. They encouraged me actually both in poetry and in visual art. So I kind of started then and then kind of fell back in and out of love with poetry over the years. I would go through sort of spells when I would be just totally absorbed and then move on to other things and then come back. And so the last 3 years I've fallen in completely. So back in.
I'm so admiring because poetry is one of those things that, I mean, people talk about, rocket science and brain surgery. For me, poetry is like the epic. It's the pinnacle of complicated things to understand and to work with.
Yeah, I mean, it might be interesting just kind of how I got back into it. I've been teaching English as a second language for a number of years, and I did a master's program in education and finished it online while I was teaching full time, and I sort of expanded my capacity while I was doing that. So when it was finished, and I was writing on the side as well. I was writing prose, trying to write prose. Anyway, writing in prose, but found at the end that something was missing. There was some musicality that was missing. And so I realized, I have to go back to poetry because there was something just so wonderful about just enjoying, almost tasting the language, when you move away from what you're trying to say and just enjoy listening to and playing with sound and image with no particular objective in mind, which is sort of part of the mission of poetry. I don't think that's all, obviously, but part of it is to explore language. I needed to get back to that, the kind of, let's rediscover language. And I realized the farther I went, the farther I moved away from prose and the sort of initial objective, which was kind of to retool my my prose writing skills, and it really became just this admiration for what it was poets were after. And there seemed to be some kind of community that's mysterious secret society or something like that, but with a mission to spread something humanistic, to be after something beautiful. There's some kind of communal something that they're after. And the more I read and listened to poets, the more there's an incredible amount of courage in facing the challenges in society for nothing. There was no real remuneration. Occasionally, there would be some kind of recognition. Then it's just this sort of mysterious, world that just opens up both self-knowledge and at the same time the beauty in the world and the recognition that there are wonderful people who have lived and continue to live in this world, and that it's really the antidote in a way, or one of the antidotes, I think, to the superficial level in which we think most people operate in the world operates, that there's a whole deeper level going on that many people without any financial objective necessarily are exploring and believe that it's really significant. And so to sort of enter into that is a privilege, even just as a reader, and then to, in one's own way, or my own way, to explore that in writing as well, is to take part in that sort of community, to enter that community. And so that's sort of where I am now, having kind of rediscovered it in a whole, in an even deeper way.
Can you tell me about a poet that you care about?
Just recently, I've been reading Rita Dove. She was a poet laureate of the United States in, I think, late 90s, early 2000s. It's interesting because the poets often have kind of weird trajectories in life. So hers is that she's African American, parents who really believed in the classics and the great books, and so her house was lined with those books. And father was a scientist. I'm not sure her mother did, but so she entered that world of great authors very young, and then got a scholarship, moved to Germany, and then spent time in Europe, married a German, and came back to teach in the States. And so she there are so many. The United States, where I grew up, is such a divided country, and tragically along racial lines, which was one of the reasons why I moved to Canada, because it really made me suffer a lot. I was just 20 when I did, and just feeling like there was just such anger and misunderstanding everywhere, and I felt that there was somewhat less of that in Canada. So anyway, but she just has risen so far above that. She's really operating on a whole other plane, although she grew up in the United States and deals with subjects that are as varied as reliving the Greek myths sort of casting the Greek myths, to exploring her grandparents' trajectory from the south of the United States to the Midwest through authors like her and Charles Simic, who was also another poet laureate of the United States. And he grew up in Serbia and lived through the World War II, and moved to the States. And when he writes about war, he doesn't write although you could say he was a sort of child victim of war. His family had to flee, and but he doesn't have the sort of classic, let's say, victim take on war, although he's fervently, from what I gather, anti-war and humanistic. But I don't know, it's like that there's some strength of spirit that I sense in these writers and so many other writers from different ages. And my all-time favorite, I would say, really for a number of years, has been Anna Akhmatova, who decided to stay in Stalin's Russia, even though she and her son and her husband and her friends and poet friends were all persecuted, and her husband was killed or committed suicide. I'm not sure. Her son was sent to Siberia, and she herself was not allowed to publish for a number of years. But she wrote this beautiful compressed verse that had to express itself through sort of a symbolic, language. And sometimes when she wrote other things that were more confrontative, if that's the word, she had to pass them on verbally to a number of people to make sure that enough people had heard different parts of it that they could put it together afterward and find a way to publish it.
That's like old school, people passing it on verbally.
Yeah, so poetry means something different in different times and different places. But she expressed something so beautiful and timeless isn't the word, heart-wrenching and just exploring the depths of human suffering and spirituality without using sort of catchwords from a conventional religion. I think those are two separate things. One's sort of religious practice, and poetry is after something unique that only that one person can express under their circumstances and with their particular imagination and sensibility. The finest poets, I think, don't really know where they're going when they start. They have an idea, but they don't know what the final destination is. And that's the most exciting thing when you read poems that sort of, you feel the discovery and it makes you want to do the same thing. So
Oh, that was
Sorry,
beautiful.
long
No,
answer.
no, that was fabulous. I was frantically trying to see if I could impress you when you mentioned the first poet, because I heard an interview a few months ago with a woman who was a poet laureate of the United States, and I thought it might be that same one, but I think it isn't. She lost her mother very young, so her poetry is partly about losing her mother, and she lost her father later, but her father was also a scientist. But I realized at that moment as I was listening to her interview that I need help with poetry. So if I hear the poet talking about their work, what inspired them, what are some of the things that they were thinking about as they were writing, that
Mhm.
helps me in a way that I feel like I can read a novel most of the time, or I can read other kinds of narrative and
Mhm.
I get it. But with poetry, I don't know if I've erected this kind of block for me. And I was even like a bit not anxious to speak with you, but I was like, am I going to be able to talk to him? Because he's going to talk about poetic things and I'm going to get lost in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think I don't sort of portray myself as an expert by any means. I think it's an ongoing process of discovery. What does poetry mean? What is this poet trying to say? And do we really know? Is it really that important? We know exactly. Maybe to have an idea of what they're after by reading, or listening to interviews or reading, some of their essays or something. It's really helpful. But one of the things that I've done, I'm as a teacher, I found that poetry was missing from the program that I teach in the English as a second language program. So I decided to create a course which is being used now in my school with some students. It just started. It's an optional course on appreciation or analysis of poetry, but recognizing that many of the people taking this course have never really read much poetry, and certainly not in English. Their first language would be French. There are certain keys, I think, that are really helpful. Understanding sort of what the tools are. Like, we know that, if you compare art forms, let's say I kind of, went back and forth between visual art and, in particular, drawing, but also painting and printmaking, and writing and poetry in particular. And that there are certain things that you have types of surfaces that you can work on, whether it's canvas or paper, and you have different types of paint, and each one has its techniques that you work on. You don't quite have the same thing in poetry, and yet there are elements that we just need to be aware of and sensitive to, and that I tried to get across in the course. And as I was preparing this course, it was like I was answering the exact same question. How do I understand poets or poetry or poems? You can't look for just the answer, like, okay, I've got it. He's or she's talking about this, or they're talking about, this particular, that's what this poem is about. I can close the book now and move on to something else. I've done that. Like, watch the film and I know what the ending is. It's not like that. You need to go back, or I need to go back and reread if I'm intrigued by a poem. And there are poems that don't speak to us, and it's okay. Maybe a decade later or something, we might come back to it, or a month later. But if it's something that intrigues us, it's a really good idea to reread it. Maybe not right away, but to come back to it afterward. And you'll discover things that you didn't notice the first time around, that you can't get it all at once. There's just too many elements. There's so much that goes into it. There's so much, and it can be sort of compressed into such a short space, so much emotion, and then the way that it just resonates afterward and leaves the silence when it's over. What isn't said in the poem or even afterward is really fascinating. It operates on a different level from prose. That's my understanding, is that there's a kind of spiritual quality to the kind of poetry that I like, and then I'll read something that isn't at all spiritual, but it's really funny and really witty and really interesting, and a kind of technical tour de force.
I'm curious to ask you, because there are the technical aspects of poetry, then there's the meaning of it. So to try to understand what's being conveyed. What do you try to explore through your work
Mm-hmm.
as a poet? What are the themes, or what are the different techniques or things that you work with?
I guess it changes. I'm after different things. Like, I've been practicing Buddhism for almost 40 years now. And so it's really an important part of my outlook on life, is to
Okay,
really,
I have to stop you for a second, Eugene, because you're not very old. So how old were you when you became a Buddhist?
oh, no, I'm older than I look.
No.
I'm 57, which is one of the great benefits of
Well,
yeah.
you were
So
young, so you were 17. So as a
I know
teenager,
I said I'm almost 40. So I was 19 when I started.
19. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So but people have said I looked younger than I am before. I used to do portraits in old Montreal and I wore a baseball cap to keep out the sun. And about 10 years ago, people thought I was 19. So there you go. That's
Good for you, Eugene. Good
that's
for you.
scary or a compliment, but it's anyway somewhere in between the two. It's kind of creepy, but anyway. So my adult life was really shaped by a kind of a strong idealism that there's something beautiful, a beautiful potential in all people, even if I don't understand it. And at the same time, we have all types of potential, including potential for all the worst, which is, what we often see in society. And sometimes if we admit it in ourselves, when we're really angry and we're really surprised at it, because we have that potential. So I kind of found that spiritual practice that really worked for me and philosophy that worked for me on a, personal level. And at the same time, I felt like this urge to, how can I contribute to making the world a more humanistic place? And there's not an easy answer. I think that a spiritual path, really, ideally, it should enrich our lives and make us seek many different ways that are unique to ourselves to express what's in our hearts. And that way we can reach across spiritual boundaries. Because what happens often is that, within a community, people are fine. And then as soon as they get beyond that community, there's conflict, whether it's a community of a political agreement or spiritual agreement or whatever it is. And how do you get beyond that? So anyway, so those are a couple of the themes. And also I'm really, really strongly opposed to the existence of nuclear weapons, like big time. For me, I'm very, very strongly pacifist and in favor of protecting human life and life itself. It's like the expression of absolute evil, the existence of nuclear weapons, and I think we've come to accept it. As soon as the war started in Ukraine, I wrote a number of sonnets. At the time, I was writing traditional form, the 14-line sonnet, all about peace and against war and against seeking violence as a means of trying to resolve anything. So nuclear weapons, the nuclear threat is something that is like something that I'm really intending to continue to pursue as a theme. But even there, writing a pamphlet is not the same thing as writing a poem. And, going beyond what we might read on CNN as a headline that comforts us if we're of that perspective, and somebody else might be comforted, but it's to seek for something that gets at a deeper level and explores it in a way that's unique, surprising, and shows empathy for it's all illusion, right? Is what leads to the evil. Let's say it's deep illusion about like lack of interest in knowing oneself, or illusions about what actually you can take with you when you die, and what a nation is it is the world really divided up along frontiers? Like, I mean, it's really silly. Poetry takes a different tack when it's dealing with these issues, and that's the exploration, and that's the discovery, the process of discovery, that you can't know exactly what the ending of the poem is going to be. You're exploring. I think it's the tension between the form, the constraint, the challenge of working within a certain form, and the desire to express something unique and express something in a way that somehow seems like you're speaking from your heart. It's something conversational. So the sort of more conversational approach is much for the past many number of years, many decades. There's been something much more conversational in I think a lot of the poetry that's written, or sort of avant-garde, really experimenting with form on the page, visual exploration. And then there's the whole concept, the whole history of poetry. It started as something that was an oral tradition, and then it moved to the page. And what is it primarily? And these are questions that each poet has to ask himself or herself or themselves. Who am I writing for? Am I writing for the reader? Am I writing for the listener? Should there be a tension between the two?
actually was going to ask you something, but I don't know if you're comfortable with it. So I didn't ask you to prepare for it at all. And it just came to me as you were speaking. I'm just wondering if you would feel comfortable reading one of your poems. We're talking a little bit about the performative aspect of it and what it means to read it aloud. And so I just thought it would be really interesting for you to share.
Yeah, no, I would love to. I think that to be fair to the reader, it's really important to read something a number of times so that we have the music of it in our mouths when we read, and we're not just kind of doing what somebody could just do if they were reading it for the first time. So I think the easiest thing for me to do would be to take one that I just read recently. Actually, you were there at the reading. There was an open mic session that they have here in Montreal twice a month, and I go from time to time. And if it's okay, maybe I'll just introduce it a little bit.
Of course.
First of all, the title is a neighborhood in Montreal, but it's also has other meanings. But it's about my grandmother, and the word that I'm going to use when I mention her in this poem is anyu. So anybody who knows Hungarian realizes that that's supposed to be for mother, Anya or Anyu, but actually we called her Anyu. I can't tell you exactly why, but my mother never told us we should be calling her Naji was what she had called her own. Anyway, that's okay. So here we go. I'll start. Notre-Dame de Grâce. Las calles de Buenos Aires ya son mi entraña. Jorge Luis Borges. My soul is in the streets of Montreal. Not the cobblestoned old town where tourists stroll, admiring handsome gray churches, each bearing the name of Notre-Dame de quelque chose, as if confessing that the feminine is missing from the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Not the broad boulevards extolling colonizers, corporate saints, or father figures of the nation, but the brown brick duplexes along the tedious blocks of Notre-Dame de Grâce, bordering Monkland, the surly shopkeepers from the old world with their select imported fare my Anu swore by, reusing bus transfers and water from boiled vegetables just to hear them call her Madame, as she relived her dream of Middle Europa, before they chased her and hers like game for the fun of it into the ravine. White kid gloves on her fingers and on mine, peering into glass cases lined with fine Hungarian pastries, pink and lime green, sour cherry soup, blood sausages, knockwurst. In the air, paprika's sharp tang, marzipan's dreamy incense, the rank fatigue of leather and suede exhaling from battered boots and shoes that had made the journey across the ocean and now hung from pegs at the back of the cordonnerie. I suppose we each have our own Notre-Dame. Mine was a frail, stooped, sinewy woman with gray-green eyes and a gentle Central European drawl, gripping my hand in hers, bearing the disdain of a continent of parvenus, bearing witness. My soul is in the streets of Montreal.
How does it feel when you read that?
Well, I love words. And when I'm reading, it's like I'm tasting the words and I'm just enjoying, and I think it's important to actually, I don't do this enough, but reading the work of other poets aloud. I don't do it as much as I should, but as well, so that you have that experience, because actually lyric poetry, or most of what we read, like that's a lyric poem, almost everything that we read or hear these days is meant to be read as though we are the narrator. So we have the experience, we relive the experience of not even just the writer, but the person whose supposed voice is, because it's not always supposed to be exactly the writer, right? So I'm just enjoying kind of, and also the images come back because it is based on, it doesn't need to be, right? It could have been fictional, right? But it happens to be images from my childhood with my grandmother and what she passed on to us. And I didn't mention two themes that are really important in, my own exploration in poetry and my writing as well. One is Montreal, a city that I really believe in. I feel it has a very important mission in the world. I feel very fortunate to have been born here, to be able to come back to Montreal by choice. And also my family, my mother and my grandmother lived through the Holocaust. And that, side of the family, my mother's side of the family, and very fortunate to have survived And at the same time, it really casts a shadow on our lives. And I'm sure that I live with that as well. And it's a way of exercising. So poetry is also therapy in a way, right? Without it being just limited to that. But I think that there's a way of trying to understand things. And there's no other way other than through expressing and hearing oneself. So as I'm reading it, I'm reliving things. I'm working when I, maybe not just this poem, but that's, the experience that I have when I read poems. It's like I'm hearing myself speak to myself and at the same time sharing with others. And I think there's something that's for me really important about the act of reading aloud is that I really want to share something with others, just like I really, really appreciate when I hear somebody else reading theirs, the generosity. And that's what I was talking about, the community. And I think the more you read or encounter other poets or whatever, the more you realize that it is really just a generous act and that it goes around, and being part of that is sharing what you have.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that reading. I think there is something around poetry, aside from all the other specific things that I said that scare me. The thing that I do like about it is the performing aspect of it, that there's something very beautiful about the words. All the technical aspects come alive when the poem is being read. Mm-hmm. And also, I would say it's very clear to me that those are personal stories. Like I can feel that when you're reading it, that's the story of your grandmother and that's the story of your love for Montreal. And I could feel that when you read it in a way that's just greater than possibly if I read it on a page. But the performing aspect of poetry, I think, is really quite beautiful.
It's really interesting because starting in the mid 80s, a movement developed almost coincidentally with development of rap. The spoken word movement really took off because it always existed. There were always, exciting poets who would be known as great readers, and there would be sort of happenings, in San Francisco with the beat poets in the 1950s. I'm reading Allen Ginsberg these days, and it's, apparently it was pretty exciting hearing him read at the time. But this movement started with a poet, I think it's Mark Wilson. Anyway, Mark something. I'm sorry, I'm not so good with names, but he wasn't getting his poetry published in the big poetry journals, and he was really, I guess, frustrated. And he said, something, I'll take this into my own hands. And so he asked a local coffee shop owner or bar owner if he could use the space for readings. And so he started what's known now as the Poetry Slam tradition in Chicago, and it revolutionized poetry. And now poetry slams are very well attended and incredibly noisy and a younger crowd. And it's really exciting to see what happens. And there are really some really fine writers reading their work there. But it's a parallel. I haven't quite figured it out, but there's definite overlap. But my understanding is that that's more of a performance. It's called performance poetry, right? Spoken word. And really the objective is to have a certain impact or effect on the listener. Now, the most sophisticated, or I don't know if sophisticated is a kind of a stuffy word, but those who are really in a little bit in both traditions, right, will think about the metaphors and everything on a deeper level. And others will be more from the gut. And there's all kinds of things in between and whatever. And there's no rules for poetry and there are no rules for what constitutes a good spoken word poem. But it's very interesting to see that dichotomy. And at the same time, this is what I was saying before, is I think out of respect for the listener, I think it's important. There's no one way to read poems, but I think that it's important to read one's poem over and over and over and over and over, let's say 100 times before reading it aloud. This is, anyway, my belief. I don't want to say that everybody has to do this, but so that you discover things about what the words are trying to say musically and to the ear of the listener, that it's not just about what you've put down on the page, as hard as you may have worked on it on the page. It has another life. There's a reason why poetry has hung on for so long and has made people pay the ultimate price often for writing something, because somehow power recognizes that there's a deeper power going on. Poetry is operating on a deeper level, and it can stir people's hearts. We live in a very materialist society where poetry is not necessarily at the forefront, but still, somehow, curiously enough, this whole spoken word tradition started, and it's, peeked out there and peeked out through rap, because there's some of the finest rap lyrics are really a form of poetry. poetry keeps creeping back, right? So yeah, so poetry. Anyway, I got off track.
Eugene, you've been fantastic.
Yeah.
I am like completely fascinated by this whole story of poetry. And I love the fact that you write poetry, that you teach poetry to young people and help open their minds to just new ways of expressing themselves. I
One,
think that's fantastic.
well, thank you. I mean, I think I discovered through them when I started practicing Buddhism at 20. One of the things that really impressed me was that the person who was sort of one of the founders of that form of Buddhism, who's Daisaku Ikeda, was a poet from a very early age and had written poetry against war, um, exploring themes that were sort of interest to me. Really, it was sort of partly reading some of those poems that got me curious about exploring poetry and mentioning poets that he had read, and that got me at a time because when I was 20, I was going through a difficult phase, and so that sort of helped to reconnect me with poetry and poetry as a sort of part of the battle to make a more humanistic world, because I think that that's a really important function of poetry. It's not just kind of fun playing with words. I think it's a really, like I said, my favorite poet, I'd have to say, is Anna Akhmatova. And Anna Akhmatova, she didn't just say, Lenin is a, evil something. She really worked it out through complex imagery, through biblical language, through exploring things through metaphor, through and and expressing the suffering of ordinary Russians through all of this. And for me, I think that ultimately that's the kind of I think that more and more people should be young people, especially, but all of us should be sensitive to the existence of poetry and be able to open up that world, which I think gives a lot of hope because there's operating on this much deeper level of kind of embracing everything, even the cruel, through on a deeper level, you can understand them rather than just saying first degree reaction. Why is this? We sort of, I don't know, I can't even summarize it, but I'm just saying sometimes you just read a poem, you're like, okay, the poem that's written from the perspective of somebody who's incredibly cruel, and it doesn't solve the problem, but there's a sense of understanding something about them that I don't know, you don't feel like a victim. It's like like somebody, if I feel like if I were locked in a prison somewhere and someone were to slip me some poems, really powerful poems, I would feel like they don't have me anymore.
Thank you so
Great.
much, Eugene. You were
Thank you.
amazing. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your time tonight. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was great.